The upcoming stimulus bill has some very exciting pieces to it, both for individuals through things like rental assistance and another stimulus check, finally. But there's also some massive small business relief programs. Maybe this might even be better for small business than it is for individuals on this latest stimulus bill. And you don't need to have some kind of huge corporation in order to get some of this relief either. That's the most exciting part. In many cases, even a side hustle will constitute as a business that is eligible for a small business EIDL grant. Maybe you're a competitive speed eater and you do it under an LLC. You can apply for one of these grants. Maybe you sell macaroni art on Etsy. You can apply for one of these grants. And we're talking from $1,000 all the way up to $10,000. And this is a grant. This is not a loan that you have to repay. This is money in your account, tax-free. Remember in the first round of EIDL grants, we saw a lot of chaos where we were guaranteed $10,000 and payments within 3 days. And that quickly turned into a joke and turned into $1,000 per employee and up to 4-month wait times to actually receive the payments. Well, some of this has actually been solved in this next round. And I have some good news, especially for those who didn't get that full $10,000 in the first time. You might actually be able to still get that. I know many of us just pretty much chalk that up as a loss, like, we're never going to get that full $10,000. Well, surprisingly, Congress has come around and you might actually get that $10,000, but it's a little bit confusing. In some ways, this grant program is now more complicated than before, but it's also more exciting. So let's just go over everything we know. And by the way, I'm going over all the details that are publicly available as of right now. As of right now, we don't know when or how the application process will work. It may be the same application portal as the first time, but we're not completely sure yet. The old portal is still open at covid19relief.sba.gov if you want to check that out, but my guess is that will likely be changed. Also, as far as the bill reads, it does not seem that you're going to be able to get a second EIDL grant if you've already received one. But if you received less than $10,000 the first time around, or of course you didn't apply the first time, you will be able to apply this time around or possibly get that bumped up. Now, in order to qualify for the full $10,000 grant, you must check several boxes. This is when it gets kind of confusing. So I'm going to first run over all the items, all the boxes you need to check, and then I'm go back and explain in greater detail the more confusing parts. There's really 2 parts that are pretty confusing. The rest are kind of self-explanatory. And I'm doing it this way because I had to read this bill text about 10 times before I could actually figure out how to properly explain it. If you try reading one of these bills, it's like a whole bunch of gobbledygook. It'll be like per section AB in this code, and then you have to go back to AB. It's a complete mess. So let me just explain this as clear as possible. All right, in order to qualify, a business must, I'm going to run off this list, be located in a low-income community, have suffered an economic loss greater than 30%, employ not more than 300 employees. You must be a for-profit or non-profit business. Either one can apply, but it must be some kind of business. You must have been in operation by January 31st, 2020. And finally, your business must have been directly affected by the pandemic. Now, that last one is basically related to the first one, that 30% loss in revenue. So those are kind of one, but they write them as 2 separate items. So that list will also be in the description if you need to reference it later. If you need to come back and check, like, do I check all these boxes? That's in the description. So let's define these more clearly, the more confusing items, starting with the need to show an economic loss greater than 30%. That sounds pretty simple, but it's a little bit more nuanced. The direct quote that defines this is the amount by which the gross receipts of the covered entity declined during an 8-week period between March 2nd, 2020 and December 17th, 2021, relative to a comparable 8-week period immediately preceding March 2nd, 2020 or during 2019. So all of that gobbledygook, basically what you need to do is take your worst performing 8-week period sometime after March 2nd, then note the revenues for that period, the total amount of money you made in that 8-week period, and then you take your best performing 8-week period sometime in the year before March 2nd of 2020, and then note the revenues in that period. How much money did you make in that period? And then you take your best performing period and subtract the least performing period, and then divide that difference by the best performing period. So I know it's still confusing, so let's do an example. Let's say your best performing period is $10,000 in revenue and your least performing is $6,000. You would take 10,000 minus 6,000, which is 4,000, and you take 4,000, divide that by 10,000, the best performing, and in this case you get 0.4, which means you had a 40% loss and you would be good to go. You can check that box. It's a roundabout way of just saying you lost revenue after the pandemic. All right, now that we have that box checked, let's move on to the next one. You must be in a low income community. There are two ways to qualify for this. Either you need to live in an area where the poverty rate is at least 20%, or you live in an area where the median family income isn't more than 80% of the statewide family income. So they want to make sure you're in a pocket where the income is lower than the average of the greater area, because they want to focus more of this money to the people who are most in need, which makes total sense to me. But in order to make this happen, they have to have some complicated guidelines and roundabout ways of figuring this out. So it's a way to do it, but luckily we have people like me who can read this bill and then break this down. Now, I know this is still confusing, so I'm going to show you exactly how to figure out if you're in one of these areas, if you can apply. And you know what? If you appreciate me reading through the bill and turning it into actual English, I would appreciate if you just liked and subscribed and shared this with someone who it might help. I know there's a lot of small business owners out there who could really use $1,000 to $10,000. And because I'm exhausted over here, I would just appreciate it. All right. Anyways, this is how you figure out if you're in one of these areas. You want to go to censusreporter.org. Then where it says start typing to pick a place, type in your city name. Now this is going to bring you to a page with a ton of census data. You'll want to scroll down just a little bit where it says poverty. There's a little title that says poverty. This will tell you the poverty rate in that area. Now 20% is pretty high, so most areas are going to be better than 20%. In the case I pulled up, the rate was 13.9%, so that doesn't hit the 20% mark. Now, you still can possibly get the access to this grant. So this next part is going to be probably the part that applies for most people. If you're not in that 20% mark for poverty, you'll want to look at the median household income under the census data. For the city I'm looking at, it says $45,653. But what we care about is underneath that, where it compares that city figure to the state average. In this case, it says the median household income in this area is 3/4 of the Arizona state average. 3/4 is, of course, 75%. So we're good to go. And individuals in this city would be able to apply for the grant, or they would be able to, if they already received the grant months ago, apply to get the full $10,000 amount, and that is really exciting. All right, now that we know who can apply, let's look at a few other important pieces with this program. Are the grants taxable? Now, I mentioned this at the very beginning. The exciting answer to this is no. We weren't sure about this before. There was some confusing consequence here where the money you received wasn't taxable income, but the IRS was trying to say, yeah, that's not taxable income, but what you spend the money on isn't tax deductible. So let's say you got a $10,000 grant, you spent that on applicable expenses, you'd still have to pay taxes on that $10,000 in profit, even though you spent it on normal operating business expenses. Well, thankfully, Congress changed this up, and this is no longer taxable. And also, on top of this, if you receive both the grant and the Paycheck Protection Loan, the grant will no longer count against your Paycheck Protection Loan. So let's say you received a $50,000 Paycheck Protection Loan and $10,000 grant. You're getting an effective stimulus now of $60,000, plus you're not going to have to pay taxes on the expenses. So, I mean, the effective stimulus amount is even greater than $60,000. And this is so exciting for small business owners, especially those who are struggling. And really, I'm very happy with the small business end of this bill. Now, another important change this time around, according to the bill, is after you apply, the SBA will have 21 days to reach a decision and see if you qualify. Now, we know they said 3 days last time. 21 seems much more doable, but can the SBA do this? Because they're going to be processing millions of applications. I'm not sure. I wouldn't personally bank on 21 days, but it's going to be closer to 21 days than it was 3 days last time. My recommendation here also is if you're close to being able to qualify to those low income markers in your area, like you're close but not quite, I would recommend applying anyways. This is because the census data has a margin of error, and they might decide to count the areas that are just like 1 or 2 percentage points off. Also, your business may still be eligible for a second round of paycheck protection funding as well, especially if you've suffered more economic loss than 25%, which is what the current guidelines are. I'm going to have an entire video on that as well, so stay tuned for that. And really, that's all we know about the EIDL grant program as of right now. I would like to thank you for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.